We've got everybody checked in and ready to roll.
Go ahead, you're open to both.
3,
Put it over to the slate now.
2, 1. Take camera 1. Go, John.
Welcome to Washington Post Live.
That was quite an intro. My gosh, we should probably just leave it right there.
I've hit the big time. Washington Post. I can go home and tell my parents what I did today.
Between Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Washington Post Live itself, we are now reaching hundreds of thousands of homes across all 50 states.
The power of this platform is it takes people into the world of ideas.
Audience members of Washington Post Live are part of the conversation.
Audience or viewer question from George Kralovic from Virginia asks, now that we have the Inflation Reduction Act, do we still need a price on carbon?
Whether it's with cancer scientists or politicians.
This panel, I think, was originally called, 2 women against Putin. It really should be 3 women against Putin. And so
the better way to get things done, as I've demonstrated, is by putting a group together and negotiating something that's good for both points of view.
I think Washington Post Live has given us as a newspaper a new platform, a common meeting ground.
When they're sitting in their own space, there is a sense of ownership and comfort.
It's great that you guys have expanded into these formats to give people a greater ability to have a longer conversation. So I look forward to talking to you today.
And their individuality comes through more so than just their title.
Thank you for being the agents and the warriors of the light and truth.
That is the lock from the night of the burglary.
Jeff Bezos bought it at an auction.
Right.
And we're trying to find out how much Bezos paid.
Right. Come back next week.
I'm so grateful to be on a platform like the Washington Post. I subscribe, I read, I love the Washington Post.
Thank you.
We need films like this. So thank you very much. Stephen, Lynn, it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Big fan. Thanks for talking to us.
I cannot thank you all enough.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kathy Baird. I'm the Chief Communications Officer and the General Manager of Washington Post Live, and it is so great to have you all here with us in person today. The COVID-19 pandemic ushered in the widespread acceptance of remote and hybrid work, but it also gave rise to the Great Resignation and quiet quitting. What those now infamous catchphrases perhaps represent is that America's workforce was largely feeling burnt out or ignored, or worse, struggling to find meaning in their work. Now there is a new generation of employers and employees that are prioritizing well-being and flexibility in the workplace. Today we're going to be joined by several of these individuals. First, my colleague Frances Steed Sellers will sit down with Alex Will, the president of the meditation app Calm, to talk about the role technology can play in our mental health at work. Next, Frances will be joined by Kelly Greenwood, the founder and CEO of Mindshare Partners, to discuss the ways in which employers can invest in their employees' well-being. Then my colleague Abba Badarai will be joined by Kyla Scanlon, a Gen Z financial educator, to discuss how her generation is placing a higher premium on mental health in their personal and professional lives. Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's sponsor for this event, Cigna Healthcare. We want to thank you all again for coming. And after this short video, my colleague Frances Steed Sellers will take the stage. Thank you.
We're Calm, the #1 mental fitness platform. Companies like yours give Calm to their people to help them focus and sleep.
It's important that leaders
send this message out clearly and demonstrate this. It's very, very different if a CEO or a leadership team demonstrates that they care about mental health. A big part of that is why 3,000 plus companies have brought Calm into their organizations, because they want to show that they care about mental health.
Good morning and welcome to the Washington Post. I'm Frances Steed Sellers, a senior writer here at the Post. I'm joined today by Alex Will, who is the president of Calm, a meditation app. Alex, a very warm welcome to the Washington Post.
Thank you very much for having me.
And welcome to everybody else here. Alex, I went to sleep last night with Calm, but I have to confess that when I did so, I was thinking mostly I try to get rid of the phone in the evenings at nighttime. And now you're telling us to pick it up to relax. Tell me about that.
Well, thank you for going to sleep with Calm last night. I think you're not the only one, the fourth person to tell me that this morning already. But I think this is an important question that you're raising. I think a lot of people feel the impact that technology has had on us. And there's a lot written about how it has brought new challenges to us. And so there's definitely a tension between, Calm being there to say we can help you through that phone. I think the real critical thing to recognize is that for many people, stress, anxiety, general well-being is a harder thing, is more prevalent in this world. And the one thing we often have with us is our phone, right? And so one of the things that's made Calm extremely successful is that we've been able to meet people where they are when they need it, whether that is to help relieve stress on a flight, whether that is after a long work day and not being able to sleep. So I think there is this tension, but at the same time, I think one of the ways that we're able to have huge impact is we all have these devices with us most of the time, and it's a way that we're able to reach people when they most need us.
We also all have stress with us a lot of the time.
Yes.
I think Gallup polls showed rising numbers again, 40% of people in this country, I think, reporting stress. Do you think those numbers are going to continue to go up? Are they real numbers, or are we reporting stress in a way we didn't before? What's happening?
Well, I think there's a number of ways we can look at this. I think on the one hand, one can read all the data, and the data clearly is showing that we are living in, I think, unprecedented times around general stress and anxiety. I think one other thing is one can just look in the mirror in the morning of how we all feel as individuals, as humans, and I think we're all juggling and managing a great deal more than maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and technology obviously plays a big role in that. It's clear to us when we look at the consumers that are using our products, whether it's the businesses that have brought Calm Business into the workplace, and even as we talk with some of our healthcare partners, that these problems are very real. And what's interesting to us is that they're not just happening in small pockets. To give you an example, with Calm Business, we support all different types of employers. So they could be retail populations, on-the-feet populations, large corporations of office workers, knowledge workers. And the things that people are reporting and sharing and the types of content they're engaging with, very similar. So on the one hand, I think the data is definitely true. I think when I look to my own life of juggling two young boys who turn 5 and 3 this October, there's a lot going on. And we definitely feel that we are doing our very best to support this crisis.
You mentioned, of course, Calm Business, and we talked about Calm to start with. I think Calm was launched in 2012, is that right?
Yeah.
And then 8 years later, so we're in pandemic land then, you launched Calm Business. Tell me about the difference between those two approaches, what Calm Business brings to the business model you had before.
Yeah, so I think what's very interesting is, 10, 11 years ago when Calm was first launched, the conversation around mental health wasn't like this. You think about the conversation we're having today, and much of the leadership that's happening by many companies to help drive these conversations, that wasn't existing so much then. I think fast forward to 2020, Calm and many others had helped push forward the conversation on mental health. It was definitely becoming more mainstream. And I think the COVID pandemic, candidly pushed that conversation and jolted us maybe even 5 years further forward on the mental health conversation. And with Calm Business specifically, what we were finding is companies were coming to us asking us, can you support our employees? How can we do that? And so I think for us, from a business perspective, it gave us the opportunity to invest and build the platform for work and mental health. And now we have 3,500 customers, and it's one of the fastest growing parts of Calm.
So Alex, tell me a little bit more about what the pandemic meant for you. Were you already thinking of creating Calm Business before the pandemic? And then how has the pandemic and the experience so many people had of remote work and existential anxieties about illness played into how employees relate to their employees and vice versa?
Yeah, so we definitely begun Calm Business before the pandemic, and it was very much a response to customers. Customers coming to us saying, we'd love to bring this to our employees. Can you help us with more? I think what the pandemic did is it just put this front and center for leadership teams, for exec teams, where this suddenly became what are we doing about mental health for our employees? And it became from a nice to have to a need to have. And I think there became an urgency around bringing this to their populations right away. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, what we've seen is, a rapid shift in the landscape. So, the pandemic had those first few years when a lot of people were at home. Folks have now returned to offices in different formats. But all that is still sort of uncertain for a lot of workers. And so what we found with our customers is they're seeking even more support for their workers. So to give you an example, one of the areas we've been supporting is by giving folks more access to information on how their employees are feeling. We saw recently a big uptick with one of our customers seeing leading into anxiety content in and around performance reviews. Another one of our customers was going through a merger, and they started to see in the data that actually people were leaning into content around stress. And what that helps them do is actually be able to understand some of the issues their employees are facing and then support them through content or other programs that we help with.
So mental health has often been a sort of an HR concern. Is it becoming a C-suite concern? Where are you seeing it
100%.
moving?
I think that's the shift that's probably happening, where this is becoming a conversation that CEOs want to know, what are we doing for mental health for our employees? And I think, the way to think about Calm in that context, very often, if you imagine a mental health spectrum, a lot of conversation goes around the more acute end of the spectrum. I think where we position ourselves is we support large swathes of a population, because mental health can show up in lots of different ways, whether it is stress before a flight, whether it is actually supporting your children, whether it is just an overall well-being feeling. What we focused on is being able to support a very large population within an employer.
So still, I'm sort of thinking we're talking generally about employers, but people who work in a hospital have very different stresses from people who work in a newsroom, as we have up here, or many other different types of employment. How do you adjust to or cater to or learn about the different kind of stresses that come out of those different workplaces?
So you're absolutely right. What's really fascinating to us is that, if you take some of our largest provider customers who have nurses and doctors as populations using Calm versus a more corporate type job, as you described, as a newsroom, the types of content are quite similar in the generic buckets they fall into. But one of the things we try and do is actually create content that will really resonate with certain groups. And so that's one of the things we've worked on over the past decade, is to create content that is super compelling for all different types of folks. And then very specifically, we also make sure that the voices that you hear from in Calm are very diverse in their representation. And the reason for that is that people will find it more engaging to hear from people that they can actually recognize and see themselves in.
So we hear that so much, meet people where they are and faces that look familiar and things like that. But what surprised you most? I mean, you're coming up with this data, you're talking to CEOs of major companies in different sectors just over the last few years. What's been the biggest surprise that's come?
I mean, there's a lot. I think one thing is how many people find it very hard to get back to sleep. So I feel like it sounds quite sort of tactical, but actually that waking up in the middle of the night and getting back to sleep is something I hear over and over and over again, and how that causes individuals a lot of stress. And I think one big thing that maybe has surprised me at a macro level is that maybe a decade ago, people used to brag about how little sleep they would get. And nowadays, I think people really understand that that's a really important foundation to, feeling happy and healthy in general.
So I can remember editing a piece for the Post by a psychologist some years ago, and she said she'd be out of work if everybody got the sleep they needed, which is, I think, a very resonant point here. But again, and more specifically, what surprised you about how people respond, or what you've learned about it, one particular sector of work, or the commonalities between, apart from sleep, between how people respond to your app and?
Well, I think one thing is that people do respond. I think maybe one surprising thing is that, you know, when we drop into a company, we tend to get 30 to 50% of that company engaging with Calm. Typically, when you have these employer-led solutions, it's in the low single-digit percentages. So I think maybe one surprise for me has been how universal these needs have been. You know, whether, you know, two companies could look totally different. They could be in completely different countries, but the needs are very, very similar. So perhaps that's a surprise. And then maybe one surprise in the speed that it's happened is the C-suite recognizing that this is an ROI question, not just a mental health question. That people are understanding that investing in mental health is good for the bottom line, and that looking after their workforce on this dimension is going to lead to a happier, healthier, but crucially more successful company.
Right. So we've had questions that have come in from our audience, and I want to ask, I'm going to read it to you. This comes from Jim Lynn from Alabama, who asks, how do you enhance well-being when a major stressor in corporate culture today is the unpredictability of layoffs? Yes, the thing that hangs over so many people's heads.
Yeah, and I think the last few years have certainly been very, very challenging on that dimension. And I think we're also very sanguine at Calm of the areas we can support and also the areas that it's going to be very hard for us to actually have an impact. I think the biggest thing that we can do and where we support our employers is to have content and tools that support the mental health of their workforce at all times. And that support, you know, we certainly hope will support through all the challenges of business, layoffs being one of them. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, it is again that point that I was making earlier of being available at all times when someone needs us is actually the biggest thing that we can offer, because it's not about waiting 3 weeks to speak to a therapist or having to do something. It's in your pocket, it's on demand, it's when you need it, we're there to support.
So we've been talking a lot about the app, but just describe it a little bit for people who aren't as familiar. I was very intrigued by moving through and seeing I could find stories to go to sleep with, or music, or breathing exercises, and it aimed at a different range of ages as well.
Yeah, so I mean the app, it's been downloaded 130 million times, I think, so far. And I think I share that because through that entire iteration and journey over the last decade, one of the things we've been so passionate about is how to make people feel just that little bit better. You know, we started life with meditation and bringing that to a large amount of people across the world. One of the things we learned was that people were using their phone at night before bed, which led to the birth of this concept of sleep stories. You know, not a crazy thought when you have young children and you read to them every night, but the idea that we could reimagine the bedtime story for grown-ups. And, you know, we've been very fortunate to have amazing voices like a Matthew McConaughey read you a bedtime story, or a LeBron James. And so we bring magical voices, incredible stories to help people fall asleep, also fall back asleep. And one can think about Calm as something to support your mental health journey whenever you need it. And meditation and sleep being two big pillars, but there's lots of other parts of the product that support in different ways.
I want to ask you about another huge topic, AI. You use AI-driven technology. I got a message on my phone this morning telling me I needed Calm for sleep. Tell me how you personalize the app for people, how you use AI, and whether you think AI is eventually going to be perceived as a general good, because I think at the moment there's an awful lot of fear about AI out there.
Yeah, for sure. I think on the personalization front, this is really important. So when you come into Calm and you tell us the things that you're looking to improve, whether it's sleep, relaxation, you know, we're constantly trying to make that product experience better for you. And you know, the way you could imagine that is if we see you engaging with content and completing content, we'll know to surface that for you again. And so we'll try and continue to build the most personalized experience we can for you. As it relates to AI more broadly, I think there's no arguing that this is the next big technological shift that's coming. And you could certainly say this could be even bigger than the internet. And I think the questions being raised around what this could mean are absolutely real. I think as we think about it within Calm, we think it can be an incredible tool for good because within the confines of Calm, it's about creating an experience that helps people feel the most happy and healthy that they can. So it's a very, very powerful technology. I think we're still in the early innings of what will be something that plays out over decades. And as we look at it within Calm, we think it can represent an ability for us to support many tens of millions of individuals through even better experiences.
And of course, baby boomers will have probably very different needs from Gen Xers. How do you talk to employers, or what questions do employers have for you about how to navigate those differences in terms of mental health needs?
Absolutely huge differences there. And I think with Gen X, it's something we hear a lot from our employer customers. It's also something we reflect in our content. So a lot of the content we have within Calm speaks to these different demographics. And, you know, for example, we'll have a Camila Cabello, who's a tremendous singer, and we'll have her in the app talking about mental health, or a Shawn Mendes talking about his experience. And I use those as two examples because I think, again, with Gen X, you know, they'll want certain things, and Gen Z will want, you know, voices that they can recognize and talking about mental health in terms that they understand.
Right. And here we are talking about mental health. Are you at all concerned that giving people a meditation app might distract from some more serious questions about mental illness that we all know? We have a mental health crisis in this country and elsewhere at the moment that we all know is prevalent. Are you worried about giving people an app and having them look after themselves in the quiet when what they may need is a therapist or a psychiatrist?
I think this is a great question, and something we take quite seriously at Calm. I think, look, let's be very clear. We believe at Calm we are in the middle of a mental health crisis. We also feel very grateful to be working on a problem that we think is one of the most important problems of our generation. And we don't think it's going anywhere. So I think, you know, that's the framing. I think within that, we recognize where Calm can help. So it's clearly a subclinical product that can support, you know...
So a subclinical
Yeah,
product, right?
very much
Okay.
a subclinical product that can support huge amounts of people because we're trying to support as many people as possible. That said, one of the reasons we built Calm Business was actually because we recognized that in the workplace there were some specific needs. So we've built out Calm Business in a way to support employers. And more recently, we've launched Calm Health, which, while still subclinical, is a product that is supporting payers, providers, and large-scale employers within mental health, and very crucially, trying to alleviate some of the strain on the healthcare system, trying to help with triage and understanding where people are on the mental health acuity spectrum, and helping to alleviate some of the burden of a resourcing perspective within healthcare.
So we're beginning to look ahead. What do you want to have happen, or what would you like to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years among employers and among other producers of content that's like yours?
Yeah, well, I think, firstly, I think within 5 to 10 years, it would be amazing to see, you know, an even greater acceleration around the importance and the recognition of mental health in people's homes, in the workplace, and then, you know, in the healthcare system more broadly. I think that's sort of the first piece. I think many of the folks in this room and many people within the mental health broader ecosystem are helping to drive that conversation, and I think that's very, very exciting. And I think if employers are able to understand and really get this idea that investing in mental health will be good for the financial outcome of companies, that mental health is crucial for the well-being of their employees, but also really recognizing that that will be good for business in the long term, I think that will be an incredibly good thing, because it will mean greater investment and more tools for employees to support them on their journey.
So right at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about having a 5 and a 3, about to be 5 and about to be 3-year-old. I think your birthday's in October. 2 sons, back in London,
Yes.
right? That's for everybody knows small children are stressful. How have your personal experiences informed the way you approach work and the business that you're running yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've found my kids to be more teachers to me than me to them for one way or another, in the sense that they reflect back so much. A good example actually is my oldest son wakes me up every morning, usually at a time before I would like to wake up. And one of the interesting things I found is, and this comes back to the relationship with technology, he and I would have a morning cuddle, and I could reach for my phone and look at an email or open my email. And the moment I've done that, I'm no longer with him.
Right.
And so I think one of the things,
bond.
yeah, I'm now on that treadmill, and I think we've all experienced that. You kind of, and you're lost. And I think one thing my children have shown me is kind of this importance of trying to be in the moment as much with them. Watching them when they just play for sometimes a very long period of time and get lost in that joy is something that I think maybe we as adults do less and less of as we get older. So they've been a great mirror for me to do that and to also find ways to not pick up the phone and just be with them for a while.
I have to, one last question. Are you going to give your kids phones? At what age? Have a sense? Yeah.
I haven't discussed that with my wife yet.
Okay, break
probably
the news
not
on
rushing.
here.
Probably
like
not
breaking
rushing.
News.
Probably not rushing. To
Not
do
rushing.
it. Yeah.
Alex, well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. And don't go anywhere. We'll be back soon with our next guest, Kelly Greenwood. Thank you.
We're calling on leaders at all levels, including you, to join the movement to reduce the stigma and spark culture change by going first and by sharing your mental health stories. I know that can take some courage, but so does much of leadership.
Good morning and welcome back. For those of you just joining us, I'm Frances Steed Sellers and I'm a senior writer here at the Washington Post. And now I'm delighted to be joined by Kelly Greenwood. We just met outside. And she is the CEO and founder of Mindshare Partners. Kelly, a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I actually grew up in Washington, D.C., so this is a full circle moment.
Good. Welcome back. So your company, the company you founded, is one of the only nonprofits devoted to this area of employer mental health. Tell me how you came up with the idea.
Absolutely. So it is very personal to me. So I have generalized anxiety disorder, which is very well managed now, and I don't actually sort of identify with that. I feel like I'm sort of recovered or in recovery. But twice in my life, it's led to debilitating depression. And I've always been a very high performer. I went to competitive schools. I was in competitive workplaces. And I had a tremendous amount of shame and self-stigma around this. And ultimately realized that I wanted to create the resources that I wished that I'd had when I was struggling and that my manager and organization had had too.
Thank you. How do you go about cultivating employer support for this approach, and how has it changed since you started?
Absolutely. Well, so much has changed. Definitely a silver lining of the pandemic, I think. We were starting to be at an inflection point prior, but that really poured gasoline all over it. So at Mindshare Partners, we are really trying to drive culture change around workplace mental health specifically so that both organizations and employees can thrive. And the goals are really twofold. One is to normalize what it looks like to have a mental health challenge at work, which is just about all of us at some point in our lives, and also to address the workplace factors that can contribute to poor mental health for everybody so that we don't have a Band-Aid solution. So when we think about how to do that, it is really culture change, and culture change on any issue really requires a top-down and a bottoms-up approach. And so we really look to support employers through our workplace custom training and strategic advising and implementation services. We work with leading industry clients like BlackRock and Pinterest and Morrison Foerster. And, you know, in terms of the top-down approach, we really look for leaders to be vulnerable and share their own stories, and also to model mentally healthy behaviors at work. And most importantly, to really prioritize a culture that is sustainable and healthy for everybody, right?
Right. So Kelly, you said something very important. I think you said it's about all of us. And I want to read back to you a quote you said before. Employers should view mental health as a collective responsibility, not just an individual one. Tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that. It's a very heartfelt phrase.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I think originally, maybe let's say 5 years ago even, employers said, okay, we have an EAP or we'll give you mental health benefits. Go deal with your mental health challenges outside of work. Go to your therapist. We don't want to hear about it. And really, most workplaces cause tremendous amounts of stress, right, and burnout, and so they are the problem in many respects. I mean, certainly there are, people that have pre-existing mental health conditions, and obviously lots of other stressors lately. But it really is imperative if workplaces truly want to move the needle on this issue for them to own their part in mental health. And so when we think about workplace factors that can exacerbate existing mental health challenges or create new ones, they're things like lack of flexibility, lack of work-life balance or integration, lack of autonomy, toxic managers, toxic cultures, all of those things. And, senior leaders and even team managers really have the ability to influence that. So we want them to take responsibility for their part.
So I think you have now more than 100 corporate clients, and you focus largely, as you've said, on training. What do your clients tell you about the challenges they're facing with employees?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think some of it depends on the sector. I think certainly Gen Z versus Gen X and baby boomers are very different populations and have very different expectations of their employers.
Just tell me a little bit specific about that.
Not to offend anyone. Yeah. I think, I saw this with my dad, but he was, had a lot of stigma around mental health. And I think one of the nicest things he said to me was a few years after one of my 2 really bad episodes, he's like, I really now realize that this wasn't your fault. And that meant so much to me, right? That it wasn't something that I could just power through, but that it was truly, a chemical and sort of social emotional issue. But so I've definitely seen that play out with especially some of the CEOs that we work with. They're willing to talk about, their wife or their daughter's mental health challenge, but not their own. And Gen Z, is far more used to talking about these things. And I think that's like a remarkable and super productive culture clash that's happening at work, and frankly was starting to happen even before the pandemic. Because Gen Z, grew up going, and some of millennials grew up going to colleges and high schools where they had mental health clubs and lots of their friends were in therapy, and it wasn't taboo, and it wasn't taboo to talk about it. And all of a sudden they get to the workplace and you're not supposed to talk about it. And so I think just the expectations for younger generations in particular about what an employer should be and what that should look like from a mentally healthy perspective are radically different.
So your company puts out, or your nonprofit puts out a report twice a year, I think, and there was one in 2019, and since 2019, we've got one coming up in October.
Yes.
Can you preview the upcoming one just a little bit, and also tell me what's changed since 2019?
Absolutely. Well, so we have been fortunate to have Qualtrics as our in-kind partner for that since the start. And we're one of the few organizations that has research with comparative pre-pandemic data. I think more have been coming into the fields, but they don't have that sort of unique apples to apples comparison. And so I think one of the things we saw certainly during the pandemic is that in our 2021 report, was the fact that, folks were obviously struggling much more with their mental health. They had more symptoms of mental health challenges, but also they felt more comfortable talking about it at work because everybody was affected, right? Nobody, I think, could say they had great mental health in the middle of the pandemic and the racial justice reckoning that followed. And they also felt very supported by their employers because, we certainly saw a huge influx of people in March 2020 saying, okay, we get that we need to do something about this. What do we do? And so employers were throwing all sorts of resources and money toward this issue. And then now what we're finding for our 2023 report is that, I heard you talking with Alex about the mental health crisis, and that's very much true in general. I would say in what we're seeing in our data with workers is that it's more of a languishing right now, to Adam Grant's term, a couple years ago. So certainly there are mental health issues, but what we found in the data this year is that employees said that they had lower prevalence of symptoms, but then at the same time, they rated their overall mental health lower. And so that seems to be contradictory. Right. And I think that to extrapolate and sort of hypothesize about where that came from, I think some of it may just be that languishing effect, right? Things were sort of coming out of the pandemic, but things still aren't great. There are, job insecurities, layoffs, forced return to work, all these things. But it's less of sort of a crisis, at least in the workplace, and it's more of this languishing feeling.
So you have a program I want to ask you about called Leaders Go First, and it's not about layoffs.
Maybe it should be.
But tell me about the impact. This is about leaders speaking up first and actually owning their own emotional and mental health struggles in front of their employees, being vulnerable.
Right.
How has that worked, and how do you foster an openness?
Yeah, well, first of all, back to what I was sharing earlier, we all have mental health challenges at some point in our life. And I think the last few years have really shown that, right? It can be a diagnosable mental health condition, or it can be stress or burnout or grief, something that's fleeting. But it is a universal experience. It's part of being human, just like our physical health goes back and forth over the course of our lives. And so when I first started Mindshare Partners in 2017, I really wanted to have business leaders come out about their mental health challenges, sort of looking to the success of the LGBTQ movement in sort of catalyzing culture change through workplaces with workplace allies and such. And no one was willing to do it. And so we have come so far, and I'm so proud because in May, for Mental Health Awareness Month this year, Mindshare launched our Leaders Go First campaign, which is a C-suite storytelling campaign about personal mental health experiences. So from the I voice, it's not the wife, it's not the daughter, it's not the friend, it is me.
Easy to speak about the
which is so much more powerful. Right. And we actually had a special message from Dr. Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, at the start of that campaign to sort of kick it off. And then we had 10 C-suite leaders share their stories on video, and just incredibly powerful and diverse stories of very real and common mental health challenges. And so when we actually go in and do workshops at companies, one of the most powerful things that we do, which I think is actually pretty unique to Mindshare Partners, is we will coach a leader, a business leader, so not a likely suspect from HR or the DEI team, and we coach them to share their personal story. And it's not always in the I voice. For example, I coached the CEO of a private equity firm who was similarly aged to my dad, maybe slightly younger, and he got emotional at the start of the workshop, which was for his whole company. And I think for folks to see that and see that vulnerability, and then also hear about its effect on his own mental health, did so much more than we could do in a workshop, because it was someone who was within that organization, who was a business leader, who was senior, and who was opening up. So that really gives employees permission to talk about mental health if they want to.
Do you think it also makes employees rally behind that leader more? I mean, I'm wondering about the impact on the business.
Absolutely. That is incredibly, very much the case. So one of the leaders that shared their story is actually the COO of the Minnesota Vikings, and he's a business school classmate of mine. And he talked about his depression, and he had first done that at the Vikings at the height of COVID, at the start, and he did that in an all-team meeting, I believe, and really just said, hey, I know what it's like to go through something hard, and you may be experiencing mental health challenges. Let me tell you about mine and how I've dealt with it. And he then I believe after the video that he did for our campaign, just received a huge influx of emails and texts from his team thanking him for doing that, and certainly applauding his courage in doing so, but also sharing their own stories. And everyone has a story.
And you have a story. You talked about it at the beginning. You announced this week that you're going to be stepping down when you're in this wave of huge success. Tell me about that.
Yes, so that was a very hard decision. I am I'm on a time zone difference right now. I live in San Francisco, and I've also been working really hard since we had the announcement on Tuesday, the public announcement. But, ultimately, I really feel at this point that stepping down is the right decision. So I want to stay as founder and board member only, and really continue to contribute to the movement and to Mindshare partners from that platform. Alex backstage was actually telling me that oftentimes when founders and CEOs step down into a similar role, it's sort of like a grandparent experience. So you have the best of both worlds, which I loved and had not heard that analogy before. So I'm very much hoping that's true. But for me, I think to your point, Mindshare and the movement has just achieved so much success in such a short amount of time. When I started Mindshare in 2017, there were maybe 2 mental health employee resource groups that I knew of in the country or frankly in the world. And now we have over 500 companies represented in our free virtual community for leaders of mental health employee resource groups. And so just to see that progress and these leaders sharing in such a short amount of time has really been remarkable. So I think for me, organizationally, the time was right, because we really are moving into our next phase of growth as an organization. It's going to be a very different job for the next 7 years, and a lot of the really important things are not the things that I most enjoy. And so I really want to focus on the things that do bring me most joy and are supportive to my mental health. And then also the workplace mental health movement as a whole is at an inflection point. And so I think the time is right for a refreshed vision as well. We've achieved a lot of my initial vision, which is shocking to me still. And then personally, it's been a very hard few years. I think as most leaders have experienced, certainly leading, and in my case, parenting 2 small kids through COVID, the racial justice reckoning, climate change. I live in San Francisco. There's been some very scary orange sky days. And the political divide has just been a lot. And then not to mention, the fact that workplace mental health intersects with everything that's going on. So one of my best friends from college was actually telling me about a year ago when I was saying how I was feeling, kind of burned out. She was saying, well, most people go to work and they can forget about all these problems in the world. And you go to work and you have to not only take care of your team, which I think there are increased expectations for a female CEO to do, but also, you are writing about this, you're coaching your clients on how to get through it. So you're not getting rid of these problems during the time that you're working. So for me, I think Jacinda Ardern stepping down really resonated with me in January. And that's part of what got me thinking. Just about the fact that a lot of top leader roles are not sustainable for the long term. And that's because of structural issues and expectations on top leaders, not anything that we're doing wrong or that the organizations are doing wrong. And so I think now it's really time for me to pass the baton to a new leader and really do the things that can rejuvenate me and practice what we preach.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one audience question because I love to hear from other people.
Absolutely.
And this one comes from Paul Surgener from Maryland to us. How do we change the perception of well-being among employers from a once-a-year issue that can be resolved by one-off gimmicks like an annual stipend or summer Fridays to an ongoing process of change?
Yes.
We have to be quick, but it's a big question.
Yes, it is a big question, a very important one. We will not do one-off events anymore for Mental Health Awareness Month or World Mental Health Day because it's a check-the-box thing and we want culture change. And so again, getting back to the original question, we really think about culture change as tops down, which I've talked about a lot of the ways to do that, including, ongoing trainings and really baking that into your work norms and having that be a part of everyday conversation, not necessarily mental health, but, what can we do? How can we make this a better place to work in terms of, not sending emails at night or on the weekends or things like that. But then also that bottoms up piece, right? And so having individual contributors, having everyone at that grassroots level participate in mental health employee resource groups, be a peer champion, have a peer listening program. And so really threading it throughout the fabric of the organization.
Kelly Greenwood, what a wonderful message to end on, threading it through the fabric of the organization. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for the work you've done. And stay with us, everybody. We'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you. Don't trip.
Businesses today aren't the only ones looking for help. Burnout and stress are affecting employees in very real ways. Keeping employees healthy is the key to future-proofing your business. And for many companies, that starts with help from Cigna Healthcare. Don't just pay for a health plan, invest in a growth plan.
Hi, I'm Elise Labott, and today we're talking about creating a more health-centered workplace. Most employees are going to feel more supported and more productive in an environment where their employer is treating them as a whole person and their whole health. And to talk about how sometimes these health problems are invisible. We can't always see them, and employees aren't exactly sharing with their employer about things that they're dealing with. And so to talk about how employees can help with these so-called invisible health issues and create a health place where workers feel more supported, I'm joined by Jill Voslow. She's the Vice President of Talent and Wellbeing at Cigna Healthcare. Jill, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Elise. Happy to be here.
When we're talking about health in the workplace, I think a lot of times there's this culture in America where even if we're sick, we work through, right? We don't call in for a sick day. Or we just kind of suffer in silence. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard for employers to know if employees are suffering because a lot of times they don't share it, or a lot of times these health issues aren't apparent. So what can employers do?
I think a starting place is really just the acknowledgement that these invisible health conditions are out there, right? So as we think about how to even conceptualize what we mean by an invisible health condition, they are things that very obviously just aren't apparent to the eye, right? And that means that when we don't understand that those things are happening for an individual, we're treating that individual with our sort of social and professional expectations.
Yeah, they're fine.
Yeah, healthy person. And so then when that individual needs to take a moment away for an appointment or maybe comes into work a little bit more distracted with a little brain fog.
A little sluggish.
Yeah, we haven't even conceptualized as their partner, their manager, their team, that something else is going on beyond a healthy person showing up to work every day.
Yeah, and I know that Cigna, because we've worked together over the years, that Cigna considers the whole employee and their whole health. But I think a lot of times, if it's not apparent, then that automatically means stress, burnout, mental health issues. That's what we don't see. But there's a lot more to these invisible health issues. Talk about what are some of these issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so rich. And just to share, with you and with the audience, I too am I'm working my way through an invisible health issue, right? So I was diagnosed at the beginning of the summer with frozen shoulder. So unless you ask me to lift something heavy over my head, you would not know that my shoulder doesn't move, right? And it means, though, that from some of the issues that Alex talked about in the first session, my shoulder stops me from sleeping. That means that when I come into work in the day, I'm a little foggy. My shoulder keeps me from being able to do all of the activities that I would normally do to work every day. I don't like to move my arm, and as a result of that, I delay typing things That means that sometimes I put off getting something done, making the notes, sending out the email, whatever. And ultimately, I have to spend time away from my workday pursuing healthcare, asking questions about where I should go, what I should be doing. I need to take time away to do those appointments. And in that span of things that I deal with in my own invisible health condition, most of my colleagues know that's going on for me. I'll show up on video and I'll have a heating pad on my shoulder that lends itself to an invitation for people to ask what's going on.
Right, but I think I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room that are like in chronic pain of some issue or another, and they just don't tell anybody.
Right.
But there are a lot of other health issues that we've discussed.
Right. So it wraps further out into things that we probably do think about in the chronic condition space: diabetes, asthma, arthritis, like those sort of crippling abilities to do some of the things that you need to do every day. Further out into the mental health space, many people can be operating on a daily basis with depression or anxiety and not demonstrate that in a way that you know that there's a challenge for them. Neurodivergent individuals who might be working through ADHD or maybe on the autism spectrum. And then it even wraps sort of further out into like challenges that come from societal or external factors. So someone who is a caregiver and is struggling with the demands of like a new situation for themselves and maybe the stress that comes from that. Individuals who are just discovering what it means to be in menopause, struggling with isolation or loneliness, and ultimately even just the challenges of some of the inequities of the healthcare system. Like those things in and of themselves can be challenges for an individual that we're not watching for and we don't know are things that may need support.
Let's talk about some of the costs associated with this mental health issues. Some are visible, like they cost money, but some are also invisible to the overall health of the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the most tangible and measurable ones are always things like utilization of the healthcare system, right? Like that is a cost to the individual, it's a cost to the company's health plan.
Or a sick day.
I'm sorry?
Or a sick day.
Yeah, and for sure, I mean, sick days, not only are sick days, like they're a payment that the employer is making for somebody when they're not at work, but it means that we're losing the productivity of that individual. And I think even from an individual's perspective, like what if you work somewhere that you don't have a paid sick day or paid time off? It can be really detrimental. And I think back to your point at the beginning, it can be a place where people don't choose not to come to work.
Yeah, they come to work, but they're not exactly like productive or...
Right.
That's where you go into the invisible.
Right, in that moment where it would be more supportive for the person to take a day off and stay at home. And like since we started talking about musculoskeletal issues with my arm, we know that 1 in 2 Americans suffer with some aspect of musculoskeletal issues, and that leads to more time away from work than any of the other chronic conditions that we have. Ultimately, a $420 billion cost to the healthcare system.
$420 billion just for musculoskeletal. That back pain, that that frozen shoulder. That's more than heart. We were talking. That's more than heart disease or any other chronic condition.
Yeah. So I am the benefits leader at my company in addition to being a Cigna employee, and it's the thing that we struggle with the most in our own employee population. $100 million, my health plan for my employees, that musculoskeletal condition.
What's the cost on productivity now? These are like less visible costs.
As an individual, perhaps feels like unseen and disconnected from the workplace, they can begin to step away from being engaged every day. I think that the holistic impact from a productivity perspective comes from the examples that I gave you about myself, right? I need to be going away to my physical therapy appointment, or I am distracted because I am spending some time like planning my next healthcare experience, even though I'm sitting at my desk. But ultimately it wraps further out into things that are less measurable, like the brain fog that might come from being at work when you didn't get good sleep, or maybe the brain fog that comes from dealing with menopause.
Or pain.
Pain, for sure. Like pain is very much a distraction. I mean, I told you my story of the way that maybe I'm not typing because I don't want to re-aggravate what's happening with my arm. And so all of those things kind of collect together in a way that it's lost productivity for the individual, lost productivity for the company. So of course, it makes a lot of sense for employers, both, we definitely bring the humanistic lens to the way that we think about our employees. Like we bring our mission to our employees and we care about them. But for any employer, and kind of back to the way that Kelly was talking in the last session, there's just so much value just in improving the productivity experience of your company by ensuring that people can stay well and have the support that they need to get to resources when they're looking for it.
Okay, so let's go deeper on that. How can employers start thinking about addressing these invisible health issues in the workplace that their employees are struggling? Because I think we don't realize that more people are probably struggling with them than we know.
Right. I do think the starting place for anybody, again, kind of hearkening back to that last session, is beginning to focus on creating an open culture that allows people to talk about it. Like, we start that conversation for ourselves very similarly. We do a lot of storytelling. We use all of our internal communication channels to ensure that employees can see sometimes our C-suite individuals, but sometimes just another employee that looks like them, working through one condition that, again, maybe if you were interacting with me at work, you would never know that I was struggling with something, but I share publicly that I have a challenge I'm working through, and then we partner that openness and destigmatization with highlighting the resources that we're offering to employees to help somebody step in and begin care through a navigation channel, through a coaching channel, through a social community that we might have at work, to ensure that they feel resourced and surrounded by people that care about getting to a good solution.
Because sometimes there's judgment. I remember one time I was telling you earlier, I went to my supervisor and I said, I have to go to an acupuncture appointment. And he was like, acupuncture? Because, this was I was dealing with a health issue, and the doctor recommended acupuncture, but there's a judgment and there's a stigma in some of these issues.
Right. I think the more that we can do, ultimately, again, the power and the value for the employer is we're caring for the person early, we're helping them get to resources early, and in doing those things, we're shortening their recovery time, we're keeping them at work. So we're motivated to make sure that we're creating an environment where if acupuncture is the right thing for you, we bring support to it. So it does start with the manager, it does start with the team. It starts with a manager establishing a one-on-one relationship with an employee in a way that allows a sense of freedom to talk about what's going on, so that then the manager can be the first line of resources to point you to where you need to go, and your team might also be able to surround you and give you the support to get into programming, tools, etc.
Okay, so we have a lot of employers in this room. What is the one thing they can do to take a more proactive approach to helping employees better manage, their health issues and help the business thrive?
I do think that ensuring that the resources that you offer are packaged in a way that it's easy for the individual to find where to start. So we're fortunate, right? We leverage a handful of navigation resources that our Cigna and Evernorth partners offer as solutions. So in an example from our workplace, as we realized that we needed to support richer access to mental health, then we instituted a product that allows navigation at the front end. Someone calls one person and says, I need help. And the navigator helps them then move through the experience, find a therapist, find other resources, and then ensures that they're cared for kind of on the back end. So I think that every way that you can make it simple and then wrap around that culture of understanding, so that individuals know that they know where to go to find a solution, and they know that once they've identified a solution, there'll be support in the work community to care for themselves and be as healthy as possible, as quickly as possible.
We just have a little time left, but what about in terms of being more proactive, offering services You had mentioned that Cigna has some programs for, everyone will do some, meditation, or everyone will do some exercise. How about, seeking them out before they notice that they're telling you that there's a problem?
Yeah, we do a lot. We do a lot as a community, and I feel like that sometimes is missing in the way that we bring through these support threads, but any place that a person can have a partner and a commitment routine or whatever. So we leverage resources like we are a participant in the Peloton business solution, and we'll leverage that programming that we provide for free to our employees to ensure that, like, once a quarter, hopefully we're not having the summer Fridays or whatever that were in that last question, but on a really regular basis, we're saying, everybody together, let's do a meditation practice. Everybody together, let's focus on mobility. And through that, that is a really great reinforcement of those cultural aspects, because it means that all the time, even when you're well, we're talking about wellness.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying is it's good for the employer and it's good for the employee. And we know that healthy, productive employees make healthy, productive companies and organizations that prioritize and invest in the workforce's future health will be ones that will thrive in the future. Jill Vaslow, Vice President of Talent Strategy and Employee Wellbeing at Cigna Healthcare. Thank you so much for joining us. Such an important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If work is not a place to fulfill life goals or a stable place to grow, then Gen Z and others will conclude that it's something that is viscerally disappointing.
The 9-to-5 job is a relic of the Industrial Revolution. I do think just the way that we work and the way that we live it has to evolve at some point, and I do think we're slowly reaching the tipping point of it doing so.
Good morning and welcome back. I am Ava Bhattrai, the economics correspondent here at the Post, and I am so thrilled to be joined by Kyla Scanlon. She is Gen Z's go-to financial educator, an author, podcaster, and content creator. You've probably seen her on YouTube or on TikTok breaking down important economic issues like inequality, the housing crisis, and Taylor Swift's impact on consumer spending. Kyla, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'd like to start with your own personal experience. You graduated from Western Kentucky University in 2019, right before the pandemic, and you went to work at an asset management firm. What were your early impressions of the state of the workforce?
Yeah, so when I graduated college, it was 2019, so 6 months later, the pandemic happened. So I only had about 6 months of true office experience, and then all of a sudden, all of us were pulled into this world where everything was totally different. So I didn't have a ton of experience working in a true office, but then had a lot of experience doing remote work, coordinating via Zoom, trying to do things via Excel remotely as well. So that was the early experience, is just having a little bit of exposure to the office and then going virtual.
And what did that shift to going virtual 6 months in? How did that affect your relationship with your job and with your perception of being in the workforce?
Yeah, I think for me and a lot of my peers at the time, it was very much, I think for everybody, it was oh my gosh, life is short. And so I think a lot of people began to reevaluate the work that they were doing. For me, I really wanted to start focusing purely on financial education and had a little bit of free time during the pandemic to focus on that. And so for me, it became more about autonomy and focusing on what I could do. And I was able to pursue that. And I think a lot of others went that entrepreneurial route as well during the pandemic, because you had the sort of flexible time to focus on that, yeah.
Absolutely. In your videos, you've spoken a lot about how the American dream is rotting in front of your eyes for a lot of people in Gen Z. You guys came of age during the Great Recession, and then you had the pandemic hit right as you joined the workforce. How has that shaped what Gen Z wants and what it values, and how is that different from previous generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think to say like the American dream is rotting before our eyes is like so intense, right? But we have a housing crisis, we have really expensive healthcare, childcare costs are through the roof. And so I think that the younger generations, my generation, is sort of looking at this and being like, what was promised is not necessarily being fulfilled. And of course, what was promised was a miracle almost. Like the baby boomers had a really awesome opportunity that was a great thing to take advantage of for them. But I think for Gen Z, like there's a lot of frustration around just being hit constantly with, not to like make it whiny, because I don't think the basis of the argument is whiny, but I think there's a lot of frustration around like, how do we afford housing? How do we afford having children? How do we maintain employer benefits, all of those things. So I think there's a big reckoning with that at the moment.
That's a great segue to the next question. I'd like to talk a little bit about mental health and how that sort of plays out in the workplace. In a recent survey, McKinsey & Company found that 55% of 18 to 24-year-olds, more than half, said they'd received a diagnosis or treatment for a mental illness. What are the pressures contributing to this, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think mental health is a very important topic, and a lot of people will point to social media as part of the issue because you're just constantly exposed to like all these things that honestly we probably should never be seeing, like all the things that we see on social media all the time. Like it's just totally exacerbating Dunbar's number, But I think that the issue here is that people are clearly expressing a need for support and a need for help. There's a lot of anxiety-inducing things that people have to deal with. So I'd say that's like what we are seeing is people are just like, I don't know how to deal with the circumstances that I'm in. And that's super difficult to solve for.
How do you reconcile that as somebody who lives out a lot of your career on social media?
Oh yeah, I mean, I recognize the hypocrisy of what I'm saying, but I think that it's really tough because like I was talking to somebody backstage, and Gen Z gets so much of their news from social media. They interact with their friends via social media. Like a lot of my friendships are purely online. And so I think that's like the double-edged sword of what we're dealing with is that we have become so entrenched in the internet world that you have to be almost a part of it. But it's also so damaging. It's like there's so many benefits, but there's also so many harmful things about it. And it's like, how do you balance those two things, and can you separate the two?
Perfect. Moving back to the workplace a little bit, studies show that compared to previous generations, Gen Z places a significant emphasis on mental health and well-being and general work-life balance. Why is that?
I mean, I think that a lot of value is in the world outside of work. So I wrote this piece with Fast Company, sort of exploring that a little bit more. And for Gen Z, I think, and for millennials as well, not to make it purely generational, and for everybody probably, but there is a lot of value outside of the workplace. So your entire identity isn't tied to your jobs, like maybe it was for the baby boomers a little bit. And so I think for Gen Z, they're like, I need to have this personal life because my whole life isn't going to be built around, this career, because as I argue in the Fast Company piece, the career doesn't necessarily promise what it used to. You used to be able to get a pension and be able to afford a house right out of college maybe, with a little bit of help probably. But I think that's part of the issue is, the job isn't necessarily the job that it was. And so there's more focus outside of that.
I'd like to squeeze in a question from our audience. Efwa Ando from DC asks, what are your thoughts on how to address workplace mental health when so many rights are under threat? Rights like affirmative action, access to abortion, anti-LGBT legislation. How do you sort of work through all of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question to answer because that's a policy question, right? How do you make sure that certain rights are enforced is something that I personally wish I had the power to do, but I don't. And I think that's where it's you have to just advocate for certain policy measures. You have to make sure that your employers are aligned with the policies that you want to see in place. And that's how you probably address that mental health issue and make sure that people feel safe and comfortable.
Can you talk a little bit from the employer's side here? Why is it important from their perspective to prioritize employees' mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you have happy employees, you have productive employees. I think tying the two together can feel a little icky sometimes, but that's the truth of it. And, people are people. And there was this clip floating around on Twitter of somebody like talking about, you work for your employer and like you should not be lazy and all this stuff. And I think that there should be maybe a little bit more symbiosis between the employer and the employee. It maybe shouldn't be as hierarchical where it's like sort of tiered. So I think that's like how employers can think about that is if you take care of your employees, they'll likely do better work for you.
Right. Corporate America has long been accused of placing profit over people. And that's something that came up a lot, especially during the pandemic. What are your thoughts on that, and how does Gen Z fit into the picture?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question to answer. So a lot of my work is like around finance, around the stock market, and the economy at large, and that's something that comes up a lot in my comment section, is like people only care about making money. And of course, when people say things, there's an element of truth to that. And so I'd say that Gen Z is probably aware. And like one thing that I've been, advocating for, because it's easy to be like, everything is wrong with the world, but you have to come up with some solutions. And I think ownership opportunities, so employee stock option plans similar to like what Starbucks has or other companies similar to that, where employees can have ownership in the company, that can help maybe distribute the profits the company is making to the people that work there. So I would say that's like the biggest thing. I don't know if Gen Z particularly thinks like that, but I think that's a good option, yeah.
Perfect. This is a generation, like you said earlier, that grew up for the most part entirely in the digital age. A lot of that has meant being on social media for your work, for your personal life. How has that shaped the way Gen Z thinks about topics like mental health and the future of work?
Yeah, I think it's, again, that double-edged sword. So when you're on social media, you're exposed to anybody who has an opinion mostly. And so there's all sorts of opinions that you have to filter through. And so I think a lot of people have found out about their mental health through social media, which is kind of tough. It's super difficult to figure out like exactly what everything means in the mental health space. And so I think a lot of people are turning to apps like TikTok and like listening to creators talk about their own journeys and then aligning with that journey. So I'd say like it's been useful for people to go along that path, but it's still tough to figure out exactly how you should calibrate your own mental health journey to what you're hearing from the crowd.
How do you balance your life online versus the rest of your life, and how do you sort of find the right balance there?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm super grateful like to have to think about that, but it's just it can be a little bit difficult because when you're online, nobody sees you as a person, so you're just kind of this character, right? And so they'll say whatever they want, and that's okay. Like, some people just have to air it out sometimes. But I would say for me, it's sometimes about balancing out the comments and just making sure that I'm remaining aligned to what I know about myself, and then also not engaging with certain topics because it can just be, it's hard. Our brains seek out negative news, like we love that from an evolutionary perspective. So I'd say that's you just being mindful of that, yeah.
Do you read all the comments?
If I do, I get kind of sad. So I don't read the comments as much as I used to. But yeah, most of them are supportive. But and I think most people can sort of realize this is like when you see one bad comment and you have like 10 really nice comments, it's like, oh, I'm just gonna focus on the really bad comment. So I would say that's something that I just have to work on, and other creators feel similar, yeah.
Perfect. And do you think the predominance of social media has helped or hindered mental health initiatives in the workplace? How do those two things work together?
I mean, I think, again, it's a double-edged sword. So I would say that a lot of people are getting a lot of information from social media about mental health, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm not sure if it's always like quality information. So I think people might be like misaligned on what exactly is going on for them. And then they're sort of trying to figure out their own mental health journey without maybe a support network in place, so they're navigating alone. So I'd say like workplaces having the efforts, as we've been talking about today, throughout all the panels, is super valuable for that journey for people.
Perfect. How has building your presence online on your own terms in social media influenced the way that you personally think about work and think about the role of work in someone's life?
I mean, I think, so there's this survey that'll float around sometimes where it's like, what do kids want to be when they grow up? And like a lot of them want to be YouTubers. And I was thinking about that because I was like, people will be like, oh, why do they want to be YouTubers? They should be astronauts. And I think what's really interesting about the creator journey is that you have a lot of autonomy and you're able to like explore different ideas. You're able to test out different ideas. You're able to sort of build community and engage with people who are also interested in the topics that you're talking about. And so I think that's like the coolest thing about the creator economy or people just creating content online is that you're able to have that autonomy. You're able to explore ideas. You're able to sort of test stuff out with people who are interested in that. Yeah.
What did you want to be when you were growing up, and was it a YouTube creator?
No, I wanted to be an author. So I have a book, that sounds like a plug, but I have a book coming out in April 2024. So it's like really cool to be able to achieve that dream. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. We are almost running out of time. So one last question. What is your biggest piece of advice to Gen Z as they enter today's workforce?
I mean, I think it's a balance, right? So one thing I've also talked a lot about, and other people have talked a lot about too, is that there's a passion crisis. So it's really difficult to figure out what you care about because there's sort of guardrails in place throughout all of the educational journey where it's like, I have to get straight A's so I can into the best college, so I can get the best job. And then you'll have the best job and you're kind of like, what do I do now? And so I'd say the biggest thing is just making sure that you're paying attention to your passions and like allowing them the space to flourish. But yeah, I would say that's like the largest thing is just knowing what you care about.
And on the flip side of that, what can employers do to make a welcoming environment for Gen Z as they come in?
I mean, I think flexibility is really big. Just making sure that, the mental health is addressed, making sure that people feel comfortable coming to their employers with issues that they might be having. And then one thing I advocated for in this Fast Company article was allowing people to explore their passions. And maybe it's a different project or some sort of idea that you could integrate into the company. But I'd say that's the biggest thing is just paying attention, yeah.
Perfect. Well, we are just about out of time. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kyla.
Thanks.
And thank you to all of you here in person and online for watching. That concludes our program. And to learn more about upcoming programs, please go to WashingtonPostLive.com. Thank you so much.